Now we are going to go through the end of chapter 9. The reason I stopped at this point yesterday is because there's a shift here. We have Nick widening out, thinking about his life overall. Many of you may have been taught in English classes that when you write an essay, your conclusion to the essay should end with a broader view, with some connection to the real world beyond the book or whatever it is you're analyzing. And that's what The Great Gatsby does here. For the last few pages here, there's a lot of introspection and reflection about what all of this might mean to the world. So Nick talks about his vivid memories coming back west from college and also from prep school. So he was sent away to a boarding school from Minnesota as a high schooler, and then also went to Yale, obviously, for his college education. And he talks about coming home at Christmas time and that he would be taking the train and that it would always connect in Chicago. So like they would, take the train into Chicago Union Station and then transfer to another train to head up to Minnesota. And he says here, those who went further than Chicago would gather in the old, dim Union Station at 6 o'clock of a December evening with a few Chicago friends already caught up into their holiday gaieties to bid them a hasty goodbye. He remembers the fur coats of the girls and all sort of the gossip and chatting about who's going to go to which parties. And then they would get back on the train, those of them that were going on, and Nick would then head up to Minnesota to his home. And he says here, when we pulled out into the winter night, and the real snow, our snow, began to stretch out beside us and twinkle against the windows, and the dim lights of small Wisconsin stations moved by, a sharp wild breeze came suddenly into the air. This is a feeling of familiarity, of home. We drew in deep breaths of it as we walked back from dinner through the cold vestibules, unutterably aware of our destiny with this country for one strange hour before we melted indistinguishably into it again. So this is just that taking for granted of your home and not really thinking about the future. He says this is his Middle West, the thrilling returning trains of my youth, the street lamps and sleigh bells in the frosty dark, and the shadows of holly wreaths shown by lighted windows on the snow. I am part of that, a little solemn with the feel of those long winters, a little complacent from growing up in the Caraway house in a city where dwellings are still called through decades by a family's name. I see now that this has been a story of the West after all. Tom and Gadsby, Daisy and Jordan and I were all Westerners, and perhaps we possessed some deficiency in common which made us subtly unadaptable to Eastern life. So this is a bigger question, and we're going to talk about some of these questions at the end. But this one is dealing with, can you ever really leave where you're from? Can you ever shed your past? And I would say, based on this paragraph, no. He says, even when he was the most excited about the East, he was aware of its superiority to the bored, sprawling, swollen towns beyond the Ohio. So like this whole sense of superiority that's on the East Coast is what drew people to it, and yet it's also what made them a little bit repulsed by it. There's an allusion here to an artist. It says here, I see it as a night scene by El Greco, 100 houses at once conventional and grotesque, crouching under a sullen, overhanging sky and a lustrous moon. Many of you may not know who El Greco is, but I would recommend that you Google his name, El Greco, and then look up View of Toledo. This is probably the painting that Nick is referring to here. And it is sort of a hilly, landscape with houses tucked in among the hills and what looks like a town, and then these very dark, stormy clouds darkening the whole area. And it is very solemn. And he thinks of it in the same way he sees people in New York walking along a sidewalk with a stretcher on which lies a drunken woman in a white evening dress, Her hand, which dangles over the side, sparkles cold with jewels. Gravely the men turn in at a house, the wrong house, but no one knows the woman's name and no one cares. So he senses this sense of impersonality on the East Coast that he doesn't experience in his hometown, where people still refer to houses by the original family who lived there. After Gatsby's death, the East was haunted for me like that. So he decides to go back to Minnesota. So at the beginning of this chapter, when he says it's 2 years later, he is writing this from Minnesota. But there's another thing he has to do before he leaves. And this reminds me of the beginning when he had to break off an engagement with somebody in Minnesota before he could start dating Jordan. Well, here he needs to break off with Jordan. So he sees Jordan Baker one last time, and she's very proud. She tells him that she's already engaged to somebody else, but she does admit that he did throw her over initially and that she felt a little dizzy for a while. These are sometimes unquote tests, this kind of a thing. This is an interesting thing that she says too. She says, do you remember a conversation we had once about driving? And Nick apparently doesn't, but of course we do. She says, you said a bad driver was only safe until she met another bad driver. Well, I met another bad driver, didn't I? I mean, it was careless of me to make such a wrong guess. I thought you were rather an honest, straightforward person. I thought it was your secret pride. So this is another situation in this book where, as a reader, we wonder, who is Nick really? Is he honest? Is he not? Is he reckless? Is she reckless? She's giving him a dig. Of course, she's hurt because he's breaking up with her, but she's calling him a bad driver. And then Nick's response is, I'm 30. I'm 5 years too old to lie to myself and call it honor. So he's acknowledging that he has flaws here. And I just want to remind you too that these young men during this time period, these 30-year-olds like Nick who had been to the war, they are the lost generation. They are the ones who basically came of age during World War I. You know, they went off to fight when they were 18 or something, 19, and then they came back and, you know, they've sort of become adults while they're on the front, and they don't really know where they fit in the world. And this is definitely what's happening with Nick. You know, he's concerned that he's 30 and he hasn't really figured out his life. This was a common theme during that time. Then he says, before he left, he also saw Tom Buchanan walking along Fifth Avenue. He was about to walk into a jewelry store, and they have sort of an awkward confrontation. Nick refuses to shake his hand. He says, do you object to shaking hands with me? And Nick says, yes, you know what I think of you. And then Tom says that you're crazy. I don't know what's the matter with you. And then Nick confronts him and says, what did you say to Wilson that afternoon? So this is a question we have not had answered yet. How is it that Wilson knew that Gatsby was the one who belonged to that car and that Gatsby theoretically hit Myrtle, even though we know it was Daisy? And Tom is sort of shocked by this confrontation and stares at Nick. And then when he stares at Nick, Nick realizes that what he himself had guessed about that afternoon was true. And so this is a good time for a prediction. What do you think happened? Well, we're going to find out. Tom says, I told him the truth. He came to the door while we were getting ready to leave. And when I sent down word that we weren't in, he tried to force his way upstairs. He was crazy enough to kill me if I hadn't told him who owned the car. So, of course, George Wilson knows Tom because he's been interacting with Tom about trying to buy a car for weeks, months maybe. He knows him. So he goes to Tom's house, and Tom, to save himself and to save Daisy, tells him it was Gatsby. And then Tom says, what if I did tell him? That fellow had it coming to him. He threw dust into your eyes just like he did in Daisy's, but he was a tough one. He ran over Myrtle like you'd run over a dog and never even stopped his car. And Nick says, there was nothing I could say except the one unutterable fact that it wasn't true. because here, even now, Nick is not going to tell Tom that it was Daisy who hit Myrtle. Then I still have this burning question about this dog. Tom says when he went to give up the flat in Manhattan and saw the damn box of dog biscuits sitting there on the sideboard, I sat down and cried like a baby. My God, it was awful. So I'm really curious. All I can think is that maybe the McKees downstairs are taking care of the dog while they're not there. That's the only logical thing I can think of. But Tom says Nick says he cannot forgive Tom or like him, and that it was all very careless and confused. They were careless people. So this is a motif like a car crash, another motif. These people just sort of do what they want and they don't care. He says they smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money and their vast carelessness, or whatever it was that kept them together, and let other people clean up the mess they had made. This is a theme of this book. So right before Nick leaves, Gatsby's house is empty. The grass on his lawn is long and not cut. It says one of the taxi drivers in the village never took a fare past the entrance without stopping for a minute and pointing inside. Perhaps it was he who drove Daisy and Gatsby over to East Egg the night of the accident. So remember, this is just sort of filling in little gaps here, that Daisy and Tom would have driven Daisy and Gatsby would have driven Gatsby's car back to his garage and hidden it, and then taken a taxi over to the Buchanan's house to get Daisy back home. Because remember, the car was at Gatsby's, but Gatsby was standing outside Daisy Buchanan's house while she was inside going to sleep. He talks about spending his Saturday nights in New York because he's too lonely to go back to his house. And he sells his car to the grocer when he's ready to leave. This could be a quiz question, just one of those tiny little details. So he gets rid of his car. And I thought this was interesting too. Like, he could drive back to Minnesota, I would imagine. I mean, maybe not. Maybe these cars don't quite do long distance trips like that. But he gets rid of his car. And remember, the car crashes are such a negative thing. The car itself is such a negative element of this story. And he sees that some kid has, scrawled some sort of swear word or something again on the brick outside the front entrance of Gatsby's house, and he sort of erases it. And then he imagines, as he looks out across the bay, what this country must have looked like to the people who first discovered it. And this is, I think, one of the most beautiful pieces of writing in American literature. He says, as the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away until gradually I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes. So these are the first people, were the Dutch, who discovered North America. A fresh green breast of the New World. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent. Compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face, for the last time in history, with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. So this is describing the American dream, what these settlers must have thought when they first saw this country. I know our country is so built up now, but there are still places in America that look like this, that sort of remind you of this time. And as I sat there brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. So here's a direct connection that this green light is the symbol for the American dream. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it, which is probably how those Dutch settlers felt. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. So he never had it. Even though he thought he could achieve this dream, it was over. He didn't know it. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. This is such an interesting image. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning. So what does this mean? If something is receding, it's moving away. So as you reach for the dream, you think it's so close, but it keeps pulling away from you the more you reach. And yet we still chase it. We still reach for it. And one fine morning, this is the hope, that one fine morning we'll catch it. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. So this is such a shift from this. To beat on is not the same as running faster and stretching out our arms. It's like desperate, hard work, going against the current, being pulled back all the time into the past. So in terms of some main ideas you want to think about here, the American dream was born when first explorers came to North America. That's one of the first things that I think we get from this. But this dream is unattainable, just like Daisy. So there's this direct connection between the dream of those early sailors and what Gatsby is trying to achieve. There's also a message here that you cannot repeat the past and you cannot escape it. So I want to review briefly just some main questions and some motifs and symbols that help us answer some of these questions. Questions have to do with theme. These are the kind of things that a teacher might ask you to write about. Remember that questions also lead us to claims that you might want to make as a writer, claims that Gatsby himself, true, but Fitzgerald, claims that Fitzgerald is making through this book. So questions, is Nick a reliable narrator? This is frequently asked. And I do think this is sort of a universal question too. Who can you really trust? Everybody is flawed. There are a lot of arguments to be made here that Nick is the most human person in this book, but also he's very conflicted. Is the American dream dead or alive? This is something that a lot of teachers ask you to think about and write about today. Is the American dream still alive, or what defines the American dream? That's the next question. And can you ever truly change your social class? Can you ever truly shed your skin and become somebody else? That's also another really important question. Motifs and symbols. So remember, motifs and symbols help an author tell his message. It helps an author strengthen the theme. These are things that often become evidence that an author is trying to make a claim, in this case about society in the 1920s. So car crashes and driving in general. Remember, the car was this wonderful modern new invention that people were so excited to have, but in reality, they caused a lot of problems. So as a symbol, perhaps the problems coming from, modernization are actually corrupting society. The weather follows the mood and reinforces the mood all throughout the book. We have the symbols of color. White is equal to old money and gold is equal to new money. So we have this idea of old and new money, which is also very prevalent. Infidelity is another motif. Daisy is having an affair with Gatsby. Tom has had multiple affairs all the time. There's this double standard of what a man can do versus what a woman can do. So definitely I would say gender roles fit into the infidelity question as well. We also have extremes of wealth and extremes of poverty. This was very much the truth during the 1920s. The majority of people, there were more poor people than there were wealthy people. And there were also a fair amount of middle-class people, but the wealthy people were the smallest percentage, and yet they were driving the culture during this time period. There's also the motif of a witness, that there's always someone watching, that the truth is inevitable, that there is judgment against you when you do something corrupt. And that's a big part of what we see with Owl Eyes, with the billboard of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, but also, Nick is a witness. Carelessness, this connects with the car crashes, but it also connects with just how they treat each other. Daisy and Tom getting out of town. There's a lot of evidence of people being careless, whether it's at Gatsby's parties or at the party in Manhattan with Myrtle and Catherine and the McKees. Just a lot of sloppy behavior. And then the green light, which is the most powerful, I think, symbol here, that is a direct connection to the American dream. So I hope you enjoyed this book. I hope you feel like you can write about it. If you have quiz questions or tests where there might be quotes to identify, my recommendation is that you go back through places where we've had annotations around conversations, and be sure to pick up on the things that the more secondary characters say, like Michaelis and Myrtle and Catherine and the McKees. Some of those people, Gatsby's father, some of those people don't say a whole lot, but what they do say is very central to their personalities and their role in the story. Thanks for joining me.